everyone. Welcome back to those returning for evening number 4 of the Buddhist Study Center 2020 summer session. And aloha for those attending for the very first time. I'm Dexter Marr, and I'll be your summer session moderator. For those joining for the first time, thank you for participating in the 46th annual Buddhist Study Center summer session. For those who attended previously, we hope that you're learning something about the global migration of Buddhism, and in particular, the evolution of Buddhism in America. The 2020 summer session is the first completely online version and offers the opportunity for us to share the teachings not only in Honolulu, but also globally. The technology we're using is a combination of YouTube and Skype. So viewers are in broadcast mode, like watching a TV program. The virtual studio is from Skype. So the only direct interaction from you, the audience, to Professor Williams is via the chat mode in YouTube. So look below your screen for something that looks like top chat. And then please send your questions and comments via chat at any time. And we will select questions from there during the questions and answers. The sooner you submit your questions, the more likely Duncan will be able to reply. Also, please give Duncan feedback on his presentations. With YouTube, he cannot see anyone. And so, to get your feel of interest or disinterest is difficult. So your comments are really, really welcome. This presentation will be immediately available on YouTube. So if you need to break away, portions or the entirety can be viewed at a later time. The format of the evening will be the same as it's been before, about 40 minutes of presentation by Duncan, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A, and then a 10-minute break for home refreshments, stretching, etc., and then a repeat. Your questions will be addressed in kind of a one-session delay, so Duncan can review them in between times. A full syllabus of homework is available at the BSC website, so you can prepare for each evening's subjects in advance. For instance, tonight's readings were from Gary Snyder, Mountains Hidden in Mountains, Dogen Zenji and the Mind of Ecology, and Stephanie Gaza's 2000 essay, To Save All Beings, Buddhist Environmental Activism. So please bear with us at the Buddhist Study Center as we learn how to produce these types of educational programs and the technology required. We selected the YouTube Skype approach for your ease of connecting, as well as a reliable connection from the BSC studio. I'll not repeat my introduction to Professor Williams and refer you to the materials on the BSC website, bschawaii.org. Last night, we learned about the profound impact of World War II on Japanese Americans, Japanese, and Buddhism on the mainland. We also learned how Buddhist values provided refuge and guidance to those in these dark times. Tonight, we'll learn about these same Buddhist values and what they might offer in saving the planet through green Buddhism. So, without further ado, Duncan, Interlinked, American Buddhism and Ecology. It's all yours.
Thank you, Dexter, for that kind introduction again. And all of you for joining on day 4 of what now seems like a marathon seminar. I'm very grateful for all of you for continuing to participate every evening in this seminar. Now, as Dexter mentioned, one of the points we left off with yesterday when we were discussing how Buddhists in these camps during World War II had to put their Buddhist teachings into practice in the most difficult of times. This is a challenge that Buddhists have had throughout the course of its history, of how to put Buddhist teachings and values into actual practice in the world. And so the topic for tonight is this thematic of how Buddhists have tried to bring their insights, their teachings about interconnectedness, their ways of living in community together in conversation with environmental questions of our times. In terms of today and tomorrow, the last day, obviously they're also interconnected. Tomorrow we'll be talking primarily about Buddhist approaches to issues around racial justice, about immigrant rights and inclusion and exclusion in our current times. And tonight we'll be talking about environmental questions around climate change and many other issues of land, air, and water that environmentalists have told us are major problems of our times. And so one of the kind of bigger points I wanted to make was that whether it's racial justice or whether it's the increasing desertification of our lands or deforestation, these are all interlinked topics. And so what I'm trying to do is focus in on a couple of those jewels, as it were, a couple of those mirrors that we talked about yesterday when we discussed the jewel net of Indra, that we're going to take a look at a few specifics that will hopefully help us see something larger about the nature of how suffering is interconnected, how suffering is interconnected between different peoples, different communities, including for today, the phrase we mentioned yesterday, all sentient beings, meaning even non-human beings, how are we all interconnected? What are the ethical values that Buddhism brings to the table? So those are the type of topics we'll be discussing today and tomorrow. So I want to just, again, like yesterday, ask the team at the Buddhist Study Center to help me with sharing my screen. Like yesterday, I'll be presenting things from my PowerPoint presentation, and I'll try to share the screens in a moment, and then there we go. And then we'll proceed as before till about 8:45 or 8:50, and I'm hoping that all of you will be on the YouTube channel sending in your questions as we go along. Now, this is a photo of this past year's Earth Day. Extinction Rebellion Buddhists in the UK and the United States. One of the people that appears in the readings for this evening, David Loy, who's written quite extensively about ecology and Buddhism. You see him here on the top left side. I think he's in Denver, Colorado or something, taking part in this protest, and he's getting arrested as part of a group of Buddhists who are very engaged in these questions around global climate change and this existential type of question facing not just Buddhists, but all people around the world. And so we see this kind of engagement in the United States, in the UK, but you also see this kind of engagement in places like Thailand. What you see here are forest monks who are putting, as you can see, a large saffron robe around this tree. It's an act of ordaining the tree. As you may know, in the Southeast Asian Theravada tradition, the Buddhist robes for ordination of a monk or a nun would involve this covering as a new ritual is performed to invite that member into the Sangha. And in this case, they're inviting this very large tree in the middle of an area of Thailand where a great deal of the forest monk tradition practices their form of Buddhism. And for them, they not only were seeing this particular tree as a member of their Sangha by ordaining the tree, but also acting in such a way so as to impact the actual economic development practices in that region of Thailand, knowing that most Thai people would not harm a Buddhist clergy member. And so by ordaining the tree, they've been working on trying to protect different forest areas in Thailand to dissuade those involved in economic development in clear-cutting forests. So they're involved in a kind of dual action of kind of expanding their notion of Sangha, but also practically trying to become engaged and active in promoting environmental protection, but from a Buddhist point of view. I'm going to start today in terms of teaching, though. So I gave those two examples as two recent examples of Buddhist environmental activism, how people are bringing their Buddhist values to the table. But today I want to structure some of what I talk about through this set of 5 lines from Zen Master Dogen. He came up a little bit yesterday, for those of you who are listening, in the section where I talked about how people made Buddhist altars and other things out of whatever wood they could find, and so anyway, and we talked a little bit about his teaching about cooking with whatever ingredients you have available to you. Today I want to talk about this same medieval Zen master. He lived from 1200 to 1253, and is teaching from a text called Genjo Koan. And I just want to go through these lines, and I'm hoping that by the end of this session you'll connect with me about why I've decided to focus today's class on these 5 lines. So he starts the teaching with starts the teaching with this line: to study the Buddha way is to study the self. The second line is, to study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the 10,000 things. When actualized by the 10,000 things, yours and others' body and mind drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. It's a very interesting practical guidance about what it is to study Buddhism, what it is to engage on the Buddhist path. But it's also a vision of what that practice means in the larger cosmos in which we find ourselves. So let's just look at this for a moment before moving on to the ecological question. He says, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. When I was a young priest, and I was just ordained when I was in my early 20s, this line meant a lot to me, because I think I came into Buddhism because I was somewhat worried, or wondering about who am I? What is, I had a Japanese mother and a British father, and I knew the language, 2 languages, and I didn't know what to think of how I belonged or existed in the world. But the first guidance from Dogen is that to study that self, to study oneself, is actually an important part is in fact the first step of studying Buddhism itself. But then this second line, to study the self is to forget the self. That seems like a shocking next line, because it's like, okay, you study yourself, but what does it mean to forget the self? I was once taught by my teacher that, in sometimes in Buddhist practice, we tend to think that our way of engaging the Dharma is to grasp things, to be able to get some knowledge, get some understanding, and if you're anxious, to get some calm and equanimity, and if you're deluded, to get some wisdom, and etc. And so he said, it's like kind of your hand grabs onto the teachings. But he says, what's interesting about Dogen is he's telling you when you're clasping something, you actually need to open your hand, to let it go. And so one of the first things that's a kind of paradoxical thing is that when we practice Buddhism, yes, we are trying to attain something, we are trying to see things more deeply, we are trying to cultivate compassion, all these values that we have, but at the same time, we're urged to let go. Let go of the self that thinks it knows itself. Let go of presumptions and assumptions about who we think we are. And as you know, one of the key teachings of the Buddha about the self, about identity, is that unlike most teachers of his time who taught that every person had some kind of Atman, some kind of eternal soul that distinguished themselves from everybody else, the Buddha taught an-Atman, no self. So what Dogen is saying here is actually a very primal Buddhist insight that the Shakyamuni Buddha himself taught, that when you look at yourself carefully, you realize that it's neither permanent nor autonomous, neither kind of set in stone uh, and distinct from everybody else. Uh, uh, and so the opposite, what Dogen, I think, and Shakyamuni Buddha was trying to say, is that the opposite is true. And in the next line, Dogen has his phrasing for that. To forget the self is to be actualized by the 10,000 things, Bambutsu. The 10,000 things is just a shorthand in the Chinese characters to mean everything. So when he's saying, when you let go of yourself, you come to know that you are actualized, you are made manifest, you exist because everything else exists. And the next line, when actualized at 10,000 things, yours and others' bodies and mind drop off. In the Japanese, this is shinjin datsuraku. Shinji, your body and mind just kind of like drop off. And it's not just your body and mind, but other people's body and minds also drop off. That's what it means to be actualized by the 10,000 things. That's what it means to actually just belong in the universe, belong in our interconnected web of life. And when you don't have to actually, therefore, achieve anything, when it's not you that's actualizing anything, then that last line comes true. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. So there's no like, oh, I got enlightenment, or oh, I got some final nirvana. Like, it's not about that, because there's no trace of any kind of realization. And that this no trace continues endlessly points to what the Buddha taught us, that in fact we live in a world that is continuously, dynamically, impermanently shifting and changing. And that's actually our universe. And so when we talk about this 5 lines of Zen Master Dogen, it's a really interesting kind of summation of what is our world, what is our practice, and to study the self, to forget the self, to be actual, all of that, and what is to practice within this larger net of life. And so for me, I wanted to start there because that's another version of our theme for this week, Interlinked, that helps, I think, get at some of the questions I want to raise tonight about what does it mean to have a Buddhist style or a Buddhist approach to these questions about ecology and the environment. I'm not going to give answers tonight, but I'm going to try to raise some questions about what a possible approach might consist of. Now, yesterday we talked a little bit about that image. Remember in the Butsudan, or the Buddhist altar made by the Nishida brothers in Heart Mountain Camp, we had this image of the lotus flower blossoming above muddy water. And I wanted to come back to that image and also talk a moment about identity and nature as two important facets of this idea of when we start to talk about what is the Buddhist approach to understanding our place in the environment. So first on identity. I have listed here 4 words: foundational, situational, integrational, and transcendental. And what these words point to is when you have a binary, when you have a binary like delusion and enlightenment, left and right, up and down, right and wrong, this world and the other world, this shore and the other, and the Pure Land. Whenever we have a binary like that in our minds, a lotus flower and muddy water, any kind of binary, there are 4 different styles of understanding the relationship between those two things. These words actually come from a study I did with a friend of mine about, actually not about Buddhism, it was actually about mixed race people and bicultural, bilingual people. And as some of you know, because I have a Japanese mom and a British dad, I've been thinking about these issues about how do you deal with that binary of being more than one thing in a fashion that doesn't exclude either parent, or how, there's so many teachings in Buddhism. Wisdom is none other than delusion. Delusion is none other than wisdom. These kind of lines from our sacred texts that show something about how we are to conceive of these binaries. And that the Buddhist path itself offers up, in Japanese we call it chudo, or the middle path, a place in between that allows us to hold multiple things at once. But in practice, how does identity work when you are trying to deal with more than one thing at the same time? One approach is to say, well, I may be, just make it up. I may be a father and a chemist, or I may be a, African American and a Korean American. It doesn't matter what it is, but when we have more than one thing that defines our identity, one style of figuring that out, it's actually, to me, not the Buddhist style, but it is an option out there, is to say, my identity, my foundational identity, my essential nature is one of them. And you kind of like pick one over everything else and say, that's who I am. That's who I really am. On the surface, I may be many things, but deep down below, I'm just essentially, foundationally one thing. So that's one kind of identity formation style or approach to figuring out yourself. Other people find that their identities shift and change based on the situation they find themselves in. And this is what's called situational identity formation. So for me, sometimes when I'm in Japan and I'm on the cell phone, I'll be bowing on the cell phone because somehow that seems more polite. And when I'm in the United States or somewhere other than Japan, I may not have those kind of mannerisms. And so those type of things where depending on who you're with, what your situation, what family members you might be with, are you in a work context or with some friends, your identity may shift and change. You may be a father and speaking in like baby language to your kid, but you could also be like a Nobel Prize winning physicist at the same time. So depending on the situation, you wouldn't talk Nobel level physics to a baby, nor would you talk in baby language at a academic conference. Depending on the situation, yourself changes. So that's another style of identity formation, situational. But then there's some people who are like, you know what? I really don't like to have to present myself differently based on different situations. I'd like to be able to have a sense of self that is integrated. If I'm more than one thing, I wish I can find a way to kind of integrate, merge, kind of find a unity that blends together all those things and have a different sense of self that is integrated and presents the same in whatever situation I'm in. Okay, that's another form and style of identity formation when you have multiplicity as part of your life. And then the final one is called transcendental. This is what is finally relating to the lotus flower. I'm sorry, this is a long-winded way, coming back to the lotus above muddy water. But another way people deal with these binaries or multiplicities is just to say, you know what? When we say things like, I'm a African American and a Korean, these categories around race or nationality or even religion, or these are just humanly constructed artificial boundaries and categories. And I am, and then fill in the blank. I'm a, you know, Buddhist or Christian, or I'm a human being, or I'm a whatever. You find a word that transcends all these different categories, divisions, multiplications of boundaries, and you kind of try to transcend it. And so one of the basic concepts of the lotus flower above muddy water is that it's based on a fundamental transcendentalist model of identity that says we live in the muddy world, but we are not of it. Right? That's a sentiment you can find in Buddhist scriptures like the Vimalakirti Sutra and others, where you're kind of in the world but not of it. You're kind of like have a root in the world, but you kind of rise up above it. That's transcendence, right? So that's something I wanted to kind of just mention as like different modalities of identity formation. And just as a personal disclosure, you know, I'm 50 years old now, and I think I've gone through all four of those styles of identity formation in the course of my life. And we cycle through probably where, you know, where one style of identity formation feels more at ease and comfort than another. And so these are all kind of styles of identity formation. And in some respect, you can find different kinds of Buddhist teachings that will support any one of these approaches. All right. And I say that because when we talk about what is the Buddhist view of ecology, or what is the Buddhist approach to environmentalism and activism, the main message I want to leave you with today is that there is actually not just one style. All right? And what I have on the left there, the nature of nature. Uh, Even if we think about the Buddhist tradition, India, China, Japan, if we think about just those three cultural zones, their view of nature is quite different. So, for example, in India, almost always the language you find about the natural world is that it's a somewhat scary place, right? It's a jungle. There are poisonous snakes. And you're trying to find a form of liberation that, in some sense, transcends the natural world. That's one fairly common uh, way of understanding how Buddhists who lived in, viharas and monasteries in the forests understood um, their relationship with nature. In China, if you can recall those famous landscape paintings with a small human being somewhere, they had these visions of nature, which is kind of vast, and the human is small. And in many traditions of Chinese Buddhism and Tiantai and all the mountains, for example, represented the realm of a Buddha, and symbolically kind of gave you a referent of how to become free. That the natural world was not something to be afraid of, but actually something to move towards. And so if you look at the names of temples in Chinese Buddhism, they always have, and this is the same in Japanese Buddhism, they'll have something, something mountain, something, something temple. The whole idea was that Buddhism is best practiced inside of nature. Inside a mountainous region is where temples and monasteries should be set up. And for example, in Korea, they went as far as to almost not have any urban temples, but only have temples in the natural world. So that's another view. But then there's a third view, which is that the natural world is not some kind of symbol or referent to a realm of liberation, a land of a Buddha, but rather nature itself is the Buddha. And that's another view that I'm going to get into in a moment, where the mountain itself is nothing other than the Buddha. Trees and plants are preaching to you as if they are the Buddha. We'll find like lots of kind of like teachings in Buddhism like that as well. So I mentioned these things at the top because when we say a Buddhist approach to X, it can be anything, to peace, to ecology, to um, racial justice. It's actually the case that both in the teachings and in the cultural lineages, as well as in the traditions and history, there's more than one view. But tonight, I also want to share with you something about my particular view. And then again, I'm trying to emphasize it's not necessarily the view of every person that thinks about these issues around what is a Buddhist approach to ecology. But my view is informed and comes out of something about places I also grew up. I was born in Tokyo, which, as all of you know, is one of the world's most dense urban cities in the world. But during the summer times, since I was age 2, I haven't missed a year yet, and I might have to this year. I'm not sure because of COVID-19 if I can spend any time in this town called Shinanomachi in Nagano Prefecture. I grew up really having my sense of what is the natural world by growing up here. It's a small town. I think it used to be about 10,000 people, but because of depopulation, we're now, I think, around 8,000 something residents in this small town in Nagano. It's right by a beautiful lake, and although it's a small town, it's got a lot of these. It's got a tourist industry during the winter, a ski industry as well, and then agriculture. And it's often categorized by the Japanese government as a place called Satoyama. Satoyama in Japanese means a place that's in between a highly developed humans, like civilization of that kind, like a human settlement, and a kind of like completely wild uh, land, something in between. Is called Satoyama, where you have the ecology of a mountain, rivers, waterfalls, coming into contact with the human habitation, having spaces like these rice paddy fields with dragonflies and so on. You find certain kinds of species that live in this in-between zone between the human and the completely non-human. Satoyama. I want to bring this up because it informs a lot of how I tend to think about what is an appropriate Buddhist way to approach the environmental question. There's a poet in medieval Japan called Saigyo, and I wanted to, he himself embodies both kind of like perspectives about what is the right. He was a well-known kind of Buddhist wanderer and an amazing poet, and he wrote two poems that I think give us a little sense of this question of like, what is the Buddhist approach to thinking about the natural world? On his first poem, this is on the left, he says this: seeping through the haze, the voice of the bush warbler. Few people passing, mountain village in spring. So that's a Satoyama poem, right? It's talking about a mountain village in spring. Already that's a combinatory idea of there's something called a mountain and something called a village. And when you are living somewhere in between, that's when you hear the bush warbler, but also a few people passing. It's where the human and the natural world intersect. But look at this other poem that he writes on the right. Deep in the mountains, no bird of birds close to what we knew at home, just the spine-tingling hoots of owls in the night. He's not in the Satoyama anymore. He's deep in the mountains, and he doesn't recognize the birds' sounds. He only hears the spine-tingling hoots of owls in the night. A wilderness, a place where it hasn't been the case that there's been generations of human interaction and engagement with that land. And there's something very interesting about what is the Buddhist view about how we should think about, are we supposed to be trying to protect a pristine wilderness? Are we supposed to be trying to find an ethic that allows humans and the non-human world to interact better? Like, what is the purpose of a Buddhist ecology, a Buddhist style environmentalism? It kind of all depends on what one thinks is the nature of our world. And Saigyo believed that actually both of these worlds exist. There is the world that where nature has been kind of diminished, but there's also the world where there is a great symbiotic back and forth between nature and the human, the Satoyama. And there's also value in the world called wilderness. And so that's another theme I want to kind of explore today. Now, in Japan, one of the reasons why, when I talked earlier about there are lineages of Buddhism that tends towards seeing the forest, the mountains, the trees themselves as the Buddha, is also because Buddhism in Japan was influenced by Shinto, the so-called indigenous or pre-Buddhist tradition in Japan. And in the so-called Shinto tradition, Shinto just means Shin can be read, another way to read it is kami, which is a Japanese word that is referring to this, a divine deity or a sacred deity, a mythological deity, but also in its roots, it comes from the Ainu word kamui, which means just a being that we hold in awe. And in Japan, traditionally, in addition to mythic gods like, Susanoo or Amaterasu or other kinds of deities that appear in Japan's mythologies, the local forest, the local mountain, the waterfall could also be a kami. And in fact, the idea of nature as kami or natural elements as the sacred, that was a very, very deep idea of of that tradition even before Buddhism ever went to Japan. But one of the differences between Buddhism and Shinto is that number two, that thing under Shinto, the way of the kami, this idea of hare and kegare, that much of Shinto practice is about purification and demarcation. And I think some of you know, in the last year or two or three, the well-known book about tidying up by Marie Kondo. You're supposed to like only keep things that spark joy, and you're supposed to kind of like cleanse out your house and don't become a hoarder and like tidy things up. Marie Kondo was a Shinto priestess before she ever became a TV celebrity or a best-selling book author. And a lot of her basic ideas come from Shinto. She believes that all things have some kind of energy. She believes that there's ways that you need to ritually purify your surroundings. You need to find ways to demarcate certain zones. These are all coming out of her background as a Shinto priestess. And so one of the things I wanted to mention was that in that tradition, tends to be strict demarcations of like where the sacrality begins and where it doesn't begin. And you can see in these photos, these torii, there's these little gates. Sometimes they're white, sometimes they're red. And on the far right, you see a string around that tree. It's kind of like the image we saw earlier about those Thai monks putting the robe around the tree. In Shinto, they put these ropes around large trees to demarcate sacrality, to demarcate a zone that humans should not be polluting. All right. And so in Shinto, they used to have lots of ideas around blood, around death, about various things that are so-called polluting agents. And so one of the big reasons why in Japan, Buddhists tend to do funerals and Shinto priests don't have a habit of doing funerals is because death is considered in Shinto as a polluting kind of like substance that especially Shinto priests should stay as far away from as possible. Whereas Buddhist priests have, long dealt with death. Shakyamuni Buddha himself, his robes were made from little pieces of fabric found at a cemetery, fabric that used to cover corpses, but was still usable. And so he used that to make robes, and the early community would make robes out of that kind of thing. That would be utterly unthinkable in the Shinto tradition, where you want to keep away from that kind of things that would be polluting to a sacred realm. So I mentioned these things, and that Shinto itself also has various kinds of environmental practices and activism around what are called Chinju no Mori, or mori, or forests that are associated with shrines. And you can see the picture of some of these things here in the slide. But this idea of protecting the natural world as equal to protecting the kami, that the land itself and features of the natural world are to be guarded, demarcated as sacred and away from any kind of human intervention. That's a very important tradition that undergirds some of the things in Japan. And I want to end this segment, and I have a lot more to say, but I want to end this hour by contrasting that with some fundamental Buddhist ideas about the nature of nature. So one of the ideas that has long infused Buddhism is the idea of Buddha nature, that nature is something that permeates not only all existence, and all beings, but is interpenetrated with the Buddha directly. And I think many of you have already come across this type of teaching in various forms. This one is, found in the Lotus Sutra. Issai shujo busho ari. All sentient beings have Buddha nature. So we know that the goal of Buddhism, right? We talked about this on day one. The goal of Buddhism is to attend to and alleviate and, if possible, release suffering. Suffering that is implicated in the fact of existence. By being born, by getting old, by getting ill and dying. Shoro byoshi, those four things, by just existing, it's said that we are implicating ourselves in a world of suffering. And that Buddhism has a method, a solution, a way of seeing things that's going to help us deal with that fundamental existential problem. And one of the ways in the Mahayana tradition, some teachings have suggested how we attend to that, is to be able to see all beings without exception. Without exception, all beings, all sentient beings, all beings that have the ability to actually participate in that suffering, as having originarily Buddha nature. That their original nature is actually the Buddha. So that's a very interesting idea that other people have then gone on to interpret and take on in new directions, such as, and one of the new directions is that if all beings are originarily already a Buddha, then what is practice? Kind of going back to that Dogen line we started off today with, it's not about grasping on or attaining something, but it's almost like returning home, returning to your original nature, which is the Buddha. So it's less about trying to become something other than who you are, but to return and to discover the fact that you are, in fact, already the Buddha. It's a very interesting basic teaching that then goes on, for example, in the Tendai tradition, to be expressed in the idea, such as the one that's written on the slide, Somoku Jobutsu, that grasses and trees attain Buddhahood. And to take that even a step further, that grasses, trees, mountains and rivers, roof tiles even, according to Dogen, preach the Dharma. If they are in fact Buddhas, they're actually teaching as Buddhas all the time. And so that's a very interesting vision of the natural world. It contrasts quite greatly with, let's say, the idea of creation in the Christian context. If we look at Genesis, God creates the world, right? So there's already a kind of like a separation. There's a creator and creation. So in many ways, Christian approaches to environment and ecology always has to do with stewarding. It's called stewardship, but you help to protect the creation that God made, because if you are if you love and respect God, you want to love and respect everything God has created, that kind of idea. But because in Buddhism there's no separation between creator and creation, there's a different point of view. All right, so I want to explore that in the second half of tonight, what it is that distinguishes and characterizes a Buddhist versus, let's say, a Christian or Islamic or other kind of religions. Is there such a thing as a Buddhist style of understanding our relationship with nature? Is there a Buddhist style of understanding ethics or responsibility to each other, not only other human beings, but to the natural world, to sentient beings who are not in the category called human? What does Buddhism say about ethics of that kind? And finally, are there ways to actually engage, activate, become active in directly modeling a Buddhist approach to environmentalism? These are questions I want to take up in the second hour. And so at this point, I'd like to just let the tech team know I'm coming out of the sharing mode, and I want to go back to see if we can talk with Dexter and to see where we are, if there are any questions. If not, there's no problem. There's many things we can talk about that's not about that, and I can even go back to last night. But I wanted to, at this point, take a pause because of the hour and see if we can take a few questions before we go into our break for this evening.
Okay, thank you, Duncan, for your fascinating perspectives in this first hour of the lecture. And I see that we have just a few questions, so I'll give you the option of either trying to quickly look at them or to do a follow-up from yesterday's questions, which we had quite a few remaining that we weren't able to get to. So it's up to you.
Okay. So maybe what I'll do is I'll combine a question that came up yesterday with a question that I'm seeing on the chat today. So I want to talk a little bit about a question that came up yesterday. Somebody asked about sectarian difference. It was an interesting question about talking yesterday about Zen and Jodo Shinshu and Shingon Buddhism and so on and so forth. And the question was about, did that have any role or effect in camp and how people understood their lived reality during World War II? I'm going to take that question and I'll directly answer it, but I also want to kind of take it into a question that I see on our chat today about these differences in sectarian approaches to thinking about issues like the environment, and is there a difference, for example, between Zen and Jodo Shinshu and so on. So let me try to tackle those questions in a combined together. So first, let me talk about World War II and the camps. One of the most interesting things I discovered in my research for the book was that in most camps, the War Relocation Authority recognized that the vast majority of Japanese Americans who they had incarcerated were Buddhist. But they didn't want to give, because of that fact, more space to Buddhists or more, so what they decided was they would give space to the Catholics, space to the Protestants, and space to the Buddhists in equal measure. And what that meant was that Buddhists had to kind of share the same Baroque church, despite the fact that they had so many different lineages of Buddhism. And the Protestants had a similar kind of problem because, Baptists had to get together with Methodists and Presbyterians, just like Zen people had to get together with Shingon and Jodo Shinshu, Nishi Hongwanji, Higashi Hongwanji, Jodoshu, etc. And in many of the camps, because of this, initially what they did was they tried to overcome their sectarian differences. For example, a Sunday service, what do you chant if you are going to do a joint Buddhist ceremony? For those of you associated with the Buddhist Study Center who are affiliated with Honpa Hongwanji and so forth, you would chant Namu Amida Butsu. If you were, in the Nichiren tradition, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Namu Henjo Kongo Daishi for Shingon people, etc. But all they could agree on was to say Namu Butsu as a way to, in some sense, compromise, because nobody could disagree that they would, want to, in a Buddhist service, honor the Buddha. But eventually people found it difficult to kind of, how should we say, compromise in that way. And because, if they actually were authentic to their particularized faith tradition, they wanted to be able to chant Namu Myoho Renge Kyo or Namu Amida Butsu, etc. And they didn't want to have to chant this other thing. And so in time, sectarian differences came about. And what they did was they staggered different Buddhist ceremonies so that the Shingon people had it this hour and the Jodo Shinshu people had it that hour, and they kind of just layered it. And it's sometimes called parallel congregationalism, where you have different groups of Buddhists, or for that matter, any other religion as well, but in using a single space where you kind of layer the different traditions and sectarian differences can be accommodated in that way. I mention this because there are different issues around whether or not there is in fact a generalizable Buddhist approach to environmental questions, or whether if you're a Tibetan Buddhist versus a Japanese Jodo Shinshu Buddhist or a Theravada Thai Buddhist, whether it makes a huge difference or not about having an approach, a common approach to saying this is a shared Buddhist understanding of how we might tackle a topic like environmental issues or global climate change and so forth. And what I would say, I know one of the questions on the chat was about the Green Initiative, Michael Nishimoto's question. Michael Ishikawa has a comment about how the language I used around Dogen, about dropping body and mind and so forth, sounds very much like Jodo Shinshu. So there are different kinds of ways in which some of the things and I'll try to talk about more of this in the second half. There are some common languages, some common approaches to a Buddhist approach to environmentalism, and some approaches that are going to be specific and more authentically true to certain sectarian traditions than others. So let me try to give an example. I think, for example, no Buddhist would say it's better to harm, plants, animals, other beings in the natural world. It's better to harm the natural world than to try to not harm it. So I think there's very little in sectarian difference that would say, oh, there's some traditions that would say, we have to show our dominion over, like in the Christian tradition, they have these vast theological differences between different groups about what is the Christian approach to environment that I don't think we'll have in the Buddhist tradition on the question of should there be non-harm as a fundamental precept that we have, whether you're a lay person or a monk or a nun, whether you are in a Theravada tradition or a Mahayana or Vajrayana tradition, that number one precept, right, do not kill, and that from the very beginning was never meant to be delimited to human beings, that we all share as Buddhists this idea that this precept we vow to take of do not kill is a shared precept among all these different traditions. They can find it in every one across in the entirety of Buddhist history. So that's an approach that's true, but how people interpret that precept is going to be different by one's point of view, by one's interpretation of different scriptures, by one's sectarian difference. And so those are things that will come up. Okay, and there's a question that I just see has come up, and maybe I'll respond to this, and then we'll move into the break. There's a question that says, can you discuss a little more about sentience and non-sentience? The word sentient usually refers to the idea that, some being has the ability to feel suffering. And the question of beings that can feel suffering and not suffering got very complicated in medieval period debates about whether or not, for example, plants had sentience or not. Because there was a valorization of, if you are part of the sentient being world where all beings are interconnected through the ability to feel suffering, that was one kind of debate that Buddhists held about suffering, the ability to feel it, and therefore the ability to connect to each other. And there's these questions of, do plants feel suffering or not? And then there's this kind of other idea that it's not that we should, in fact, think about it from the framework of sentience, but in fact, the real Buddhist insight is that there is no disconnect between any being at all. And so even the non-sentient, even if plants were considered non-sentient, even if Dogen talked about roof tiles as non-sentient, but non-sentient and still the Buddha. And so the idea that even things that we considered non-sentient, like roof tiles, were actually ultimately composed of clay, of human beings, that we were all connected. Even things that seem inanimate, non-sentient, is actually ultimately interconnected with everything else. And so that's another view that I wanted to kind of just touch on. We'll go into that in more detail in the second half. But I know we're at that hour that it'd be good to take a bathroom break or a snack break. And so let me close it with that and then come back in about, I think, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, I think Dexter has indicated previously. Let's come back at that time. Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan. Okay, so we'll be taking a 10-minute break at this point. By our Hawaii time at 6:04 p.m. And there is a lag, so you'll be getting this probably about 6:05 on YouTube. So from about 10 minutes from now will be when we restart. So it'll be about 6:15 Hawaii time. So we'll see you in 10 minutes. welcome back, everyone. And thank you, Duncan, for such a great first hour. And looking forward to learning about how we as Buddhists can be green Buddhists. So take it away.
Okay, so for the second hour, I want to share again my screen and the PowerPoint so that I can talk through a little bit more and then take any questions that you may have. I wanted to start with I mean, they seem like big words, but it's actually a fairly straightforward concept called anthropocentric versus biocentric Buddhism. I mentioned in the first half that it's not like there's only one approach to how Buddhists understand their relationship with the natural world. And in fact, Buddhism has both some inclinations and traditions that would put the human being at the center of the cosmos, that would be called anthropocentric, and other traditions of Buddhism that would put the natural world at the center and human beings not as just one part of this larger ecology. And I thought I would start with this image because I actually wrote a book, I wrote an article or a chapter in a book that I edited back in 1997 called Buddhism and Ecology. And the chapter that I wrote in that book had to do with this ritual in Japan called Hojo-e. It's a practice of releasing animals such as fish or birds as a part of making merit, of somehow by the act of releasing captive animals, you would demonstrate your kind of like compassionate heart and thereby earn like good karma or what they would call merit. That would be seen as a meritorious act. And in the article, which was about Japan, I talked about two different scriptural traditions that underlaid that ritual practice. One that said that it's important to do rituals like that so that we understand that us human beings and all other beings are interconnected and equal, as equally sharing in Buddha nature. So that was one scriptural justification for why one would do a ritual practice like releasing birds or fish and so forth. But another equally important scripture explained the justification for why it was worthwhile to do a ritual like that by using the metaphor of intergenerational family connections. So this particular sutra said, imagine the fish you're about to release, or imagine the bird you're about to let free into the air as if it were your grandmother or grandfather. Meaning, maybe some members of your own family, for example, or your own acquaintances, friends, family members, who may have committed some kind of demeritorious action in the past, had landed up in a form that would be considered lower than the human form, an animal form. And this was based on, in Japan, they would call it the Rokudo, or the six realms. They talk about Asuras in certain realms and Devas, and then the human being was in this kind of middling realm, and then below the human being were animals and plant, and beings in the in the hell realms and the hungry ghost realms and so forth. And there's this idea of a hierarchy of being, or hierarchy of different kinds of beings, and that the beings that lived in the heavens versus the beings that lived in the Buddhist hells, even if the Buddha taught that none of these destinies were permanent, because the Buddha, taught impermanence. And so even if you were in hell, that didn't mean you were there, like forever. Still, they did make a kind of hierarchy or difference, and they considered animals to be of a lower status than humans. And to help family members who may have fallen into that status, you would do this ritual and kind of release animals that had been captive. And so rather than, say, killing them or eating them or whatever, you'd release them. So this practice not only was very popular in medieval Japan, but what you see on the screen is actually some Tibetan monks, I think, dropping a lobster in Boston Harbor, I think, and then some other people engaged in this in contemporary times as well. And I remember seeing a New York Times article that talked about a group of Buddhists who were putting lobsters and other shellfish and other fish and so forth into the Hudson River, and local ecologists raising a huge stink about putting non-native species in those waters. And it was kind of like, Buddhists versus environmentalists was kind of like the framing of that New York Times article, because they were engaged in this practice called hojo-e, this kind of releasing of animals ritual that has this kind of long-standing practice in Buddhist, especially Buddhist East Asia, but also you find it very commonly done as a ritual in Thailand and so forth. And some of the critiques of it have to do with the fact that often to have in a large-scale way the ability to release captured animals, you have to first have gotten and captured them. And oftentimes, to release, let's say, 1,000 fish, you will have had to collect 3,000 fish and put them in tanks. And by the time you got to the ritual day, 2/3 of them will have died before you could release the 1,000 fish. And this kind of thing of like these kind of moral questions about what is in fact the correct, thing to do when you are trying to showcase something about Buddhist compassion and interactivity with the natural world, but if it's actually causing more suffering and death, is that proper? So these kind of questions have actually permeated not just Buddhists, in the current moment, but was debated in previous centuries as well. So I raised that very particular example to kind of raise the question about what is Buddhist ethics. And I want to maybe skip ahead momentarily here, this question of Buddhist ethics. And I think I earlier mentioned that, no Buddhist would say killing is a value of Buddhism. Like it's not valorized in any way. And actually, so reducing killing and that's one of the first precepts we take. But one of the interesting things about Buddhist ethics is that unlike, let's say, the Mosaic Law, that idea of the 10 Commandments written in stone, kind of like set as a firm ethical guidance, Buddhist ethics is a little bit different. One of the things that we often, need to discuss is what happens when you try to keep one precept but you have to break another one to keep it. So it's not exactly parallel to like, showcasing the release of animals, but you have to, capture more of them to be able to actually do the ritual and the ethics of that. We often, have these dilemmas in our life. So, for example, if somebody came, like, because I teach at a university, and we often have these kind of situations where we're increasingly, unfortunately, in the United States, whether it's elementary schools or high schools or colleges, we've had these incidents of mass shootings. And let's say somebody came into my classroom with some kind of automatic gun or something, and something terrible was about to happen, and they asked me, but they were actually looking for one specific individual who was in the class. And let's say the students were hiding, under their desks, and that gunman asked me as a teacher, I heard that you have so-and-so in your class. And let's say I knew that student was one of the students hiding under the desk. And I told that gunman, oh, actually, I believe he went out into the corridor to go to the bathroom, and I lied to get the gunman to go away into a different direction, and thereby broke the precept, a very important precept of not lying, but keeping the precept of not killing. Because if I had told the gunman the truth, that maybe that student was actually right there underneath that desk, it would almost have been a certain death for that person. And so sometimes Buddhists have this kind of very interesting moral and ethical dilemma of seeing the precept collection, not lying, not stealing, not killing. All these things are also interlinked, also find themselves up against each other, and we have to weigh the karmic consequence of what our actions actually mean. And we can't get away with not taking the consequence, So one of the ways that I've heard it described very elegantly is by the Vietnamese Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. He would often say that Buddhist ethics, the rules, the precepts that we enjoin to ourselves, is like a guidepost. And he compared it to the North Star. In Buddhism, we use the metaphor of the morning star to talk about the Buddha's, kind of awakening under the Bodhi tree, and he sees the North Star and, has a certain kind of awakening. Thich Nhat Hanh very elegantly used this metaphor of the North Star. As you know, in America, many African American slaves used the North Star in their underground, journeys to escape towards the north, where they could find freedom, and they would move in the middle of the night using the North Star as their compass, as their guide to know where freedom was. And Thich Nhat Hanh often talks about the North Star as somewhere that you don't actually want to go to. It's up in space. There's no oxygen. If you actually arrive there, you wouldn't be able to live. So it's actually not the place you want to go, but it's a guidepost that gives you a hint about what direction you need to be walking in. And so he explained the Buddhist precepts, like don't kill, don't steal. It's like that. You can't actually do it perfectly. You can't keep them absolutely, but they help you orient and guide towards the correct direction of alleviating and reducing suffering instead of increasing it, but that you can't actually do it perfectly, or you can't sometimes keep it perfectly, or sometimes you have to break one precept to keep another. And he calls that interbeing, which is a different way of, I think, expressing what I've been trying to say with interlinked. But it's an ethic that comes out of the fact that we are, in some sense, enmeshed in a jeweled net. We live in an ecological system in which everything we do has impact on everything else. So I mentioned this basic orientation around ethics before we get into that question of anthropocentrism versus biocentrism. And I talked about anthropocentrism as this idea of the human as this, there's a tradition within Buddhism that says the human being is in a perfect amount of suffering. Not so much like in hell that you can't find any way out, but not so released from suffering like beings living in the heavens that don't care about investigating their self, investigating existence, life and death carefully. The human beings are therefore in that perfect middle position of the cosmos. So let's call that the anthropocentric position. But there are also biocentric views within the Buddhist tradition as well. And so I want to go back one step to Dogen again and look at another piece of writing. And if you read the Gary Snyder piece for today's class, you'll know that he's referring a lot to this particular chapter called Saigyo. Literally, San means mountain, Sui means water, and Kyo means sutra. And it's not a typical regular canonical sutra, but a sutra that Dogen makes up called Mountains and Waters Sutra. And I want to read this selection from that interesting piece of writing that influences Gary Snyder, who is one of the most important early American, Buddhist ecologists. He's somebody who had a very important standing within the environmental movement early on, and also, I think, a very interesting standing within the American Buddhist community. He came into contact initially through Kammo Imamura. We talked about Bishop Imamura the other day, his son, in Berkeley, California, before going to Japan to become a Zen monk and train in Shugendo, the mountain ascetic practices, and so forth. And he came across Dogen and felt something about a Buddhist perspective that was a biocentric one. And let me read this passage from Dogen, and I think you'll see why Snyder assessed Dogen in that manner. So Dogen says, all beings do not see mountains and waters in the same way. Some beings see water as a jeweled ornament, but they do not regard jeweled ornaments as water. What in the human realm corresponds to their water? We only see their jeweled ornaments as water. Some beings see water as wondrous blossoms, but they do not use blossoms as water. Hungry ghosts see water as raging fire or pus and blood. Dragons see water as a palace or a pavilion. Some beings see water as the seven treasures or as a wish-granting jewel. Some beings see water as a forest or a wall. Some see it as a Dharma nature of pure liberation, the true human body, or as the form of body and essence of mind. Human beings see water as water. So it's a little bit complicated. Dogen sometimes writes in a way he's pulling from other lines of thought and he's flipping them and doing interesting things. But basically, as I talked about earlier, there's some reference here to, for example, the hungry ghosts. It's one of the 6 realms that I mentioned earlier. He also talks about dragons. And in classical Japanese and Chinese literary tradition, dragons are supposed to live under the sea. And they have a dragon king, dragon princesses, and so forth, living in a palace under the sea. And so he says, dragons see water as a palace or a pavilion. But what about that sentence before? Hungry ghosts see water as raging fire or pus and blood. For hungry ghosts, these are beings who have committed enough kind of negative things that they fall into a realm that's one level above hell. It's not quite hell, but it's one level above it, but still pretty bad. They, in form, tend to have very thin necks and very large bloated stomachs. They're constantly hungry because of these large stomachs that need to be filled, but because their necks are so thin, you can barely get any food down there. And whenever they try to put even like a little bit of food down there, some water down there, it feels like, because it's so thin, that it's creating fire. It's breaking the small passageways, and it's like pus and blood is coming out. And so for hungry ghosts, water is like a raging fire or pus and blood. So it's we human beings that see water as water. But if we take the mind of other beings, the same thing might actually be seen as a completely other thing. And so this is an interesting passage about inviting Buddhist practitioners to understand that we live in this interconnected realm in which, if you cared to, you could actually try to see things from another point of view, whilst acknowledging, given who you are, your point of view. So that's a passage I wanted to bring up as an interesting kind of commentary on this issue of anthropocentrism and biocentrism. The scripture that gives us this image about the jeweled net, I think I've already spoken about it in previous lectures, so I won't repeat myself, but basically this idea that we live in an infinite net in which there are an infinite number of jewels cut in such a way that they're like mirrors, where if we look at one jewel, we see the whole universe, and when we see the whole universe, we see ourselves as one jewel. That teaching comes from a Buddhist scripture called the Avatamsaka Sutra in Sanskrit. In Chinese, it's called the Huayan Sutra, and in Japanese, the Kegon Sutra or the Kegon Kyo. And in that sutra, it gives us a little bit more of a hint about how ethics works in that kind of jeweled net. So let me read this out loud as well. In what manner should one accommodate and serve sentient beings? To do so, one should think, throughout the realm of dharmas and the realm of space, and in the ocean-like cosmos in the 10 directions, there are infinite kinds of sentient beings. Some are born of eggs, some are born of womb, of wetness, or of metamorphosis. Some live by earth, some by fire, by water, fire, wind, space, trees, or flowers. Oh, countless are their kinds, and infinite are their forms, shapes, bodies, faces, lifespans, races, names, dispositions, views, knowledge, desires, inclinations, matters, costumes, and diet. They abide in the numerous kinds of dwellings, in towns, villages, cities, and palaces. They comprise the devas, the nagas, the heavenly musicians, the tree nymphs, humans, non-humans, beings without feet, beings with 2, 4, or many feet. Some are with form, some are without form, some with or without thoughts, or neither with nor without thoughts. To all these infinite kinds of beings, I will render my service and accommodate them in whatever way is beneficial to them. Why should we cherish all sentient beings? Because sentient beings are the root of the tree of awakening. The bodhisattvas and the Buddhas are the flowers and fruits. Compassion is the water for the roots. So this is a very interesting passage that really gives us a kind of more detailed sense of living in this infinite web of life that the Huayan Sutra talks about, and how the basic Buddhist ethical principle is to water the roots, compassion, to have that calm, meaning with, right, and pathos being suffering, to be in the world of suffering together with all beings, and that liberation comes from serving all beings because of that basic understanding that we live together and our destinies are intertwined. So that's, I think, something I wanted to do to point out before kind of moving to the very final section of what I want to touch on today. If you read the readings for today, there's Gary Snyder's Hidden Mountains piece. And he has this set of comments. Actually, I'm going to go for the second one first. He says, all these organic and inorganic realms interacting is what we would call the biosphere, and would be referred to in Buddhism as all sentient beings. It can be called a community of practice. It's a huge lineage of which we are all members. So in this piece, because he's a Buddhist and an ecologist, he's trying to connect the language of biosphere and ecology with what in Buddhism is referred to in classical texts as the realm of all sentient beings, a community of practice, he calls it. And in his piece and the other piece that we read for today that Barnhill wrote on Snyder, there's this notion of Sangha, one of our 3 treasures or refuges that every Buddhist would agree on. What is Sangha? What is the community of people, of beings that constitute the Sangha? In its most narrow meaning, of course, it means the so-called fourfold Sangha, consisting of monks, nuns, laymen, laywomen, the fourfold community of those who follow the Buddhist teachings and the Buddha's way. But in Snyder's take of the word Sangha, or community of practice, he means it in a very expansive way, because we are all connected. Whether or not you've taken precepts or not, you are interlinked with every single being in this vast cosmos, this biosphere, wherein your responsibility as a Buddhist when you practice is to take account of this very large Sangha, a huge lineage, as he calls it, of which we are all members. So that's a really, I think, important kind of way that we can also think about Buddhism and ecology, is to think about it in terms of ethics, but not necessarily in a grand sense of like the cosmos or like the interlinked nature of the jeweled net, but in a more simple, direct way, which is to say, when we know that we are interconnected, what is our Sangha? And this is a very, I think, interesting answer to that question. The other thing Snyder does in the essay is that he links the idea of ecology with the idea of economics. So let me read this piece. Ecology is originally based on biology. It now incorporates methods and information from physics, mathematics, and even engineering. The English word was created in the 19th century from the Greek root oikos, which means household, plus the Greek logos. In this case, ecology simply implies thinking about the household. It's close to the word economics, which means the rules of the household, from nomos, laws or rules. Now, one of the bigger questions about a Buddhist approach to the ecological crisis, the global climate change, all the different aspects of pollution in our air, land, waters, deforestation, everything that is interlinked in what we would call the crisis of our moment in terms of ecology, is almost inevitably linked to this word ecology is linked to this word economics. There's almost no way that we can really have smart, sensible solutions from a Buddhist point of view on ecology without having smart, sensible points of view about what is a Buddhist take on economics. So one of the things I wanted to leave you with tonight, this is again quite a while ago. I think 1997. When I published that edited volume, Buddhism and Ecology, that same year, I had the opportunity to translate a book written by the vice president of the Bank of Japan, and a man called Inoue Shinichi. And he had written two books, one about a kind of book on Buddhist economics, a kind of foundations book. And although he was very high within he was like, the American equivalent would be like the vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, so like a senior member of the government, and somebody who had been trained as an economist and guided economic policy for Japan. He wrote this book about Buddhist economics, and he also wrote a book called 地球を救う経済学、仏教からの提言, and literally an economics to save the earth, a Buddhist point of view or perspective, or a way to think about it from Buddhism. And so I took those two books, and Kodansha, the publisher in Japan, asked me to translate it into English, and I put it out as a book called Putting Buddhism to Work. And it was a book about Buddhist economics and management. And the big 2 points that came out in that book that I've to this day still found quite helpful was this idea of thinking about economics from a Buddhist point of view that understood how interrelatedness worked. So in the Jodo Wasan, there's a phrase, jiri, rita, emman, and literally it translates into self-benefit, other benefit, meaning not your self-interest, but the self-interest of others, emman, so kind of like are interconnected in one big circle, eng. And this idea that a Buddhist economics would be one that every calculation about profit, every calculation about how to start up a company, every calculation about how you would manage such a country, treat your employees, work together on projects in a firm, would inevitably involve this question of, is one making decisions, systems, procedures that understands that self-benefit, other benefit is actually part of a circuit, that it's interconnected, and that sometimes the best decisions are not about what will get you the highest profit in your next quarterly earnings report, but more about how you set up a structure in the company that gives benefits for different stakeholders, including this other, in the Buddhist sense, always includes non-human beings. What if we had an economics that took into account the non-human world, that beings of many different kinds, sentient and perhaps even non-sentient, to take every being and their benefit into account? What kind of economics, what kind of economy, what kind of sustainable future could we build from that? So that was one idea that I wanted to share from this book on Buddhist economics, because I do think it's actually central to thinking about a possible futures and imagining a more sustainable ecological lifestyle and economy that will impact things like global climate change. But the other thing he did was he had this, little formula. He said, in economics, we tend to think about happiness being equated with how rich you are, how wealthy one is. But he said the Buddhist take on this is that you need to, on the right-hand side of the formula, divide wealth with greed. This is one of the obviously key teachings in Buddhism, is that you lessen unhappiness or suffering by reducing one of two things. You either reduce it by reducing greed, or you reduce it by reducing ignorance. One of those two things. And in this case, he's saying, when you think about it, if you understand that this is the formula to be happy, to feel content, to not be under dis-ease or dukkha, which you usually translate into English as suffering, but really meaning uneasiness. How do you overcome uneasiness, dukkha, suffering? Is it just about wealth, or is it about wealth divided by greed? Because if it is, then there are more than one ways to become healthy, happy, content, at ease in this world. It's not just about the endless chase for money, because you can also work on the bottom half of that equation. When you have a high amount of greed, according to this formula, let's say you have, the number 100 on the greed, and you're a really wealthy person, and so you have, $1 million dollars on wealth, but if you're divided by 100 or 1,000 on the greed end, then the happiness quotient goes way down. Whereas somebody who had, $3, but only one, level 1 on the greed scale, would actually be happier than somebody who had a tremendous amount of wealth, but never felt satisfied, never felt happy with that wealth, because the greed quotient was so large in that formula. And so it was a very interesting way that he mapped that out as to what values we might want to bring from a Buddhist point of view into these discussions. So I just realized the time is nearly out. So I'm just going to just end with this last slide of my friends over in the San Francisco Zen Center, the Green Gulch Farms, the Green Dragon Temple there, as just an interesting example of how to do it. How to take something like Jijita and Mom, those ideas about making one big circle, of having Buddhist practice be integrated with ecological principles, running a Buddhist temple that combines organic agricultural practice, being able to serve, restaurants like Greens, this vegetarian restaurant in San Francisco, go to sell your organic produce as, produced by Buddhist practitioners with care and mindfulness, and become involved in the economy as well. Because it's one thing to rail against an economy that's unjust. It's another thing to model what the alternative can be. And so I want to kind of tie this up and conclude by talking about Satoyama, that idea I brought up at the first part of my talk. That place in between the mountain and human habitation, that place where we interact with the natural world. There's something very productive, very creative and imaginative that we can do in that realm of recalibrating our ethical relationships with each other, with all beings, and also model something of what it would mean to have an economy and an economics that was actually based on our Buddhist values. What would that look like? One example I can think of are my friends over in the Bay Area doing this kind of work. But there are actually many examples in Buddhist communities around the world. And I want to kind of close it there and go back to the studio to see if there are final thoughts, reflections that Dexter might want to share. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and join everybody back in the studio.
Hey, thank you, Duncan. That was terrific. I see that there's actually quite a few comments and questions that you may want to make some final comments on before we set up for tomorrow's session. So would you like to address some of those?
Sure. Let me see here. Well, there's actually a number of good questions, and we're almost out of time. So what I want to do is share one of these comments from some of my other friends at the Daifukuji Soto Zen, in temple in Kona, Hawaii, who has a comment here. I would like to greatly reduce the use of disposable plastic utensils and wooden chopsticks at temple functions, especially because there's no longer plastic recycling on Hawaii Island. Perhaps this pandemic will encourage people to bring their own sets of dishware and utensils to gatherings where food is served and shared. The wisdom of oryoki from Jiko. So Jiko Nakade, Reverend Nakade, I have a lot of respect for out in Kona. And what she mentions here is a really important guidance for us, which is that, we can think on this kind of macro scale of, sustainable economics and how economic systems need to be recalibrated to become more just and sustainable. We can think about global climate change and some of the big policy moves and decisions we need to make, but we can also think about people bringing their own sets of dishware and utensils to temples. It's these smaller acts that actually manifest and make real our teachings about what I started with Dogen. When we forget the self, we become actualized by the 10,000 things. It's because every single act of ours has a karmic consequence, that every disposable plastic and chopsticks, that's actually about oil drilling. It's actually about deforestation. We don't see it that way sometimes, but actually it's connected to these larger global issues around the environment. And our small acts can have this massive effect throughout this web of life. And so I applaud that comment from in the chat from Daifukuji temple in Kona, Hawaii, because if it is those small acts that ultimately reverberate, and as all of us begin to do just a small amount of change each, they become cumulative. They do multiply through that web. I can't emphasize that enough. A lot of people think like if you don't have all the knowledge in the world about, this policy or that law or, that you can't do anything. And I think many people feel overwhelmed by how much suffering and how much, you know, how systemic some of these problems in the world are, and feel a little bit helpless to do anything. But because we are interlinked in the way we are, it's actually quite doable. It's these small acts that ultimately add up to a much larger transformation. And so I would love to recommend that whether it's Daifukuji or any other temple, we can find our own Sangha commitments to do the smaller things that together, when we do it together, it will have this multiplying resonance throughout the web of life. And so let me close with that and let you know that tomorrow I'll be shifting our focus to a different jewel, a jewel about racial justice, about inclusion and exclusion, some of those type of topics that are still really important in our times. And I'll also try to get to the other questions that are in this chat that I couldn't get to today.
Okay, thank you, Duncan. That was wonderful. Yeah, your thought about how our small actions, all reflect from our jewel in Indra's net and ripple, throughout the net, is so fundamental and beautiful that hope we can all, remember that, as we, do every little small action that we have a choice to do every day. Okay, so tomorrow, we will, again, if you look at your program, we'll be covering the topic that's on the cover, which is the